My husband died 3 years ago. Before he died, he wrote me a letter, sealed it in a blue envelope, and put it in a safe. He told me, "Open it when something feels wrong." He had already named her. He had already described what she would do. He had already built every wall she would never find a door in. He was gone 3 years before she made her move. He had already won. The biscuits were Harold's recipe, not mine. I want to be clear about that, because people who visited our kitchen for 30-some years always assumed I was the one who perfected them. I was not. Harold Whitmore, a man who could read a structural blueprint in under 10 minutes and quote baseball statistics from memory, spent 3 full Sundays in 1987 figuring out the precise ratio of butter to flour that made those biscuits pull apart the way they did, soft in the center, just barely golden on top, the kind that hold a spoonful of peach preserves without going soggy. He wrote the recipe on the back of an envelope and taped it inside the cabinet door above the mixing bowls, where it still lives today, slightly faded, edges curled at the corners. I made them every Sunday because that was what we did. Even now, 3 years after I buried Harold on a Tuesday in October, I make them on Sunday mornings, not because someone asked me to, because the kitchen smells right when the butter hits the cast iron, and for about 45 minutes, the house feels the way it used to. Patrick and his family came at noon. I heard the car before I heard the knock, that particular sound of tires on the gravel patch near the side gate, a sound I've known for over 20 years. Patrick came through the back door the way he always did, kissed me on the cheek, and asked if he could do anything. I told him to set the table. He did. Sophie was behind him, backpack still on, the way teenagers carry everything they own like a second spine. She dropped it by the staircase, came into the kitchen, and lifted the edge of the dish towel I had over the biscuits. "These smell the same as always, Grandma," she said. I told her they were supposed to. Vivian came in last. She was wearing a cream-colored blouse and dark slacks, her hair set the way it always was on Sundays, like she had somewhere more formal to be afterward. She kissed my cheek, too lighter than Patrick's, and set a bottle of sparkling water on the counter without being asked. "Something smells wonderful, Eleanor," she said. She never called me Ellie. I noticed that years ago and filed it away the way I filed most things. We sat down at 12:15. I had set the table with Harold's good plates, the ones with the blue border that we bought at an estate sale in Franklin back in the 90s. Biscuits in the center, peach preserves from the Amish market on Charlotte Pike, a pot of Earl Grey, and sliced tomatoes from my backyard garden, which had done better than expected this year. For a while, it was just lunch. Patrick talked about a project at work, something about server migration, which I nodded at politely while understanding approximately none of it. Sophie ate 2 biscuits and asked if she could take some preserves home. I said she could take the whole jar. Vivian smiled at that, the kind of smile that sits above the eyes but doesn't quite reach them. It was somewhere between the tea and the tomatoes that she started. It began with a story, the way most carefully laid things do. She mentioned that her aunt, who was in her early 80s, had recently had a scare involving a gas burner left on overnight. "These things happen," Vivian said, her voice gentle with practiced concern, "especially when someone is living alone. It's nobody's fault. It's just something you have to pay attention to." Patrick set down his fork. Not because he disagreed, because he was listening. "I've noticed a few things lately," Vivian continued, turning toward me with an expression arranged into something resembling care. "The stove, Eleanor, last month when we stopped by, one of the back burners was on low. You were in the garden and you didn't realize it." She paused. "And your doctor's appointment in September." "Doctor." "Reeves's office called Patrick to confirm, and it turned out you hadn't written it down." "I rescheduled it," I said. "Of course." She nodded. "And your reading glasses, Patrick found them in the garage, which is a little unusual, isn't it?" I looked at my son. He was studying the tablecloth. "I go to the garage every Tuesday," I said. "The recycling bins are in there." Right. Another nod, soft and unhurried. We worry is all. Patrick and I both do. You're here by yourself, and this is a big house, and we just want to make sure you're all right." The table was quiet. Sophie was looking at me from across the biscuit plate, and in her expression I recognized something I had seen before, not concern, but watchfulness, the kind that stores information. I reached for my tea. "I appreciate that," I said, and I meant the words to land evenly without weight on either side. "This house and I have gotten along just fine for 79 years, but I hear you. Vivian smiled fully then, the way a person smiles when they believe they have made a point. We finished lunch. I sent Sophie home with the preserves and 2 biscuits wrapped in foil. Patrick helped me carry the plates to the sink, and for a moment it was just the 2 of us by the window, and I thought he might say something. He didn't. He dried his hands on the dish towel and said he'd call me in the week. After they left, the house settled into its Sunday quiet. I washed the cast iron by hand the way Harold taught me, dried it thoroughly, and set it back on the stove. Then I went to the hall table, the narrow one beneath the mirror near the front door, where Harold used to leave his keys every evening without fail, and I opened the top drawer to take out his old leather diary. I kept it there because it made the house feel occupied in the right way. The weight of it, the smell of the worn binding. The drawer was open. And it was empty. I stood there for a moment with my hand inside the drawer, touching nothing. I checked the second drawer. I checked the side table in the living room. I checked the shelf in the study. The diary was gone. The kitchen clock read midnight when I finally stopped trying to sleep. I had lain in bed for 2 hours with my eyes open, listening to the house settle around me the way old houses do in autumn. A creak near the upstairs hallway, the low hum of the refrigerator below, the occasional rustle of leaves against the back porch screen. These were familiar sounds. I had cataloged them over 32 years until they became a kind of white noise, the background music of a life lived in one place for a long time. But underneath the familiar sounds was something else, a stillness in the wrong place, the feeling of a sentence with a word missing. I put on my robe and went downstairs. The tea I made was Earl Grey, the same kind Harold and I had kept in the cabinet above the stove for as long as I could remember. I filled the kettle, stood at the window while I waited for it to boil, and looked out at the backyard in the dark. The garden was just a shape out there, the outline of the rose beds Harold had planted the second year we lived here, the low fence along the property line, the oak tree in the back corner that had been a sapling when Patrick was born and was now wide enough that 2 people couldn't reach around it together. I thought about Harold. I do that often enough that it no longer startles me the way his presence fills a room even now. But that night, sitting at the kitchen table with both hands around a warm mug, I thought about him with a particular kind of clarity. Not grief, exactly. Something more like recognition. Harold Whitmore was not a complicated man. He was an engineer by training and by temperament, methodical, precise, and deeply unbothered by things that could not be measured. He wore the same style of work boots for 30 years. He kept a single legal pad on his desk and wrote in block letters so neat they looked typed. He did not believe in leaving things to chance, which was why, when he loved something, he built a structure around it. He built one around our life together, piece by piece, over decades. I remember the afternoon 25 years ago when he came home from a meeting with a lawyer downtown and sat across from me at this same kitchen table with a folder of documents between us. He explained it the way he explained everything plainly, without drama. He had set up an irrevocable living trust. The house, the savings account, and the investments were all inside it. Nothing in the trust could be transferred, sold, or otherwise moved without my direct written consent and my signature, verified in person. Not Patrick's consent. Not a court-appointed representative's consent. Mine alone. He slid the folder across the table and told me to read every page. I asked him why. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because I've seen what happens to people who don't plan, and I'm not going to let that happen to you." I read every page. I signed where he indicated. And then I filed the documents in the fireproof cabinet in the study and didn't think about them again for years, the way you don't think about the deadbolt on the front door until you actually need it. 3 years ago, Harold was diagnosed in January and gone by October. Those 9 months had a quality I still find difficult to describe, a kind of compressed tenderness, as though every ordinary thing we did together had been quietly promoted in meaning. We watched the evening news. We drove to Centennial Park on Sundays. I made soup, he read. We didn't talk about dying, exactly, but we talked about everything adjacent to it, in the way long-married people talk sideways and slowly, circling the center of things. It was a Tuesday in August, about 6 weeks before he died, when he asked me to come sit with him in the study. He was in his chair by the window, thinner by then, but still himself, still with that particular stillness he carried. He had a piece of paper in his hand with a series of numbers on it. He told me the combination to the fireproof safe in the bedroom closet, the one we had bought years ago for passports and the deed to the house. He told me he had put something inside it for me. If anything ever feels wrong, he said, open the safe, blue envelope first. I asked him what was inside. He looked at me with that expression I had known for 40+ years, the one that meant the answer was both simpler and more complicated than the question. Everything you need to handle whatever comes, he said. You'll understand it when the time is right. I memorized the numbers. I wrote them in the small notebook I keep in the nightstand drawer, in the back, behind the pages I actually use. And when Harold died on a Wednesday morning in October, 3 days after he had stopped being able to speak, I put his wedding ring in the fireproof safe alongside whatever he had left me, and I closed it and I did not open it again. That was 3 years ago. I had not opened it since, not once, not for any reason. There had been moments in the months after Harold died when the idea of looking inside felt too close to something I wasn't ready for. And then time passed, and the urgency faded, and life became manageable again, in the way grief eventually becomes manageable. Not gone, just folded into the ordinary fabric of things. I sat at the kitchen table until my tea went cold. Then I rinsed the mug, set it in the drying rack, and stood in the kitchen for a moment in the quiet dark. Down the hall, past the study, past the living room with its row of family photographs along the mantel, Harold's reading chair still angled toward the window the way he had left it. Something was wrong. I had known it since I stood at the hall table with my hand in an empty drawer. And Harold, who had known me for 46 years and had never once underestimated the weight of a feeling I named, had known it might come long before I did. I turned off the kitchen light and walked toward the bedroom. The closet was at the back, behind the winter coats on the left side. I moved them aside by feel in the dark, my fingers finding the smooth metal door of the safe where it had always been. I pressed my palm flat against it for just a moment. The metal was cool and solid and exactly where Harold had left it. I reached into the pocket of my robe for the small notebook from the nightstand drawer. I had carried it downstairs with me without consciously deciding to. The numbers were on the last page, written in my own careful hand. It was time. I stood with my hand on the safe a moment longer than necessary. Not from fear. Harold had never been a man who left frightening things behind. Whatever waited inside that safe, he had placed there deliberately, with the same care he gave to everything that mattered. I stood there because my mind had caught on something else entirely, a face, a pair of eyes across a lunch table, and the particular way a 15-year-old girl had gone very still when Vivian finished speaking. Sophie. I taught elementary school in rural Kentucky for 22 years before Harold and I settled in Nashville. In that time, I came to understand that intelligence shows itself in different ways, and the kind that is hardest to teach is also the kind most adults consistently underestimate. Not the intelligence of quick answers or high test scores, though Sophie had those as well. I mean the intelligence of attention, the ability to occupy a room fully without appearing to occupy it at all, to register everything and give nothing away. I had met perhaps 5 children in 22 years of teaching who had it. Sophie had it from the time she could walk, but I did not understand the full weight of it until 3 years ago, the spring before Harold died, when she began spending Saturdays at the house on Magnolia Street. It started because Patrick's weekends were consumed by work, and Vivian's schedule ran on its own demanding rhythm. Sophie was 12, old enough to be left somewhere, young enough to need a somewhere to be left. Patrick dropped her off Saturday mornings with a backpack of homework and the relieved expression of a man with one fewer thing to coordinate. I was glad to have her. Harold was slowing by then, and the house had grown quieter than I was used to. What I did not anticipate was how carefully she watched everything. The first few Saturdays, I noticed only that she asked real questions, not the polite, obligatory kind children produce for adults, but genuine ones. She wanted to understand how Harold had designed the slope of the garden beds to manage rainwater runoff. She wanted to know why the books in the study were organized by subject and then by year rather than by author. She listened to the answers and wrote notes in a small spiral notebook she kept in the front pocket of her jacket. Not conspicuously, just the way a person records something they intend to remember. I recognized the habit. It was one of my own. Then Vivian began stopping by. Not every Saturday, perhaps once or twice a month, on mornings when Patrick had mentioned he would be elsewhere. She was always pleasant, always deliberate. She moved through the house with a particular ease, the kind that belongs to someone taking inventory. The first time I noticed her open the cabinet beside the hallway telephone, the one where Harold kept the property insurance documents and the deed copy, she did it in a single smooth motion, glanced inside, and closed it again, as though she had only been reaching for something nearby. I said nothing. I filed it away. Sophie noticed it too. I know this because of what she said on an October Saturday afternoon, a few weeks after one of Vivian's visits. Harold was resting. Sophie and I were at the kitchen table. She had a history chapter open in front of her, and I was going through a box of old photographs. The house was quiet in that particular autumn way, and then Sophie said, without looking up, "She takes pictures of things." I set down the photograph I was holding. "Who does?" "Vivian." Sophie turned a page. When she's in a room by herself, she takes her phone out and photographs things on the counter or on the desk. She thinks no one sees. I did not ask how long she had been watching. I did not ask why she hadn't said anything sooner. Children who observe carefully also understand, instinctively, the difference between the right time to speak and the wrong one. I said, "Thank you for telling me," and meant it, and we sat together in the comfortable quiet that had become natural between us. After that conversation, I paid closer attention to my own house. What I found, slowly, over the following months, was a pattern assembled from small pieces. Vivian's interest in paperwork that was none of her concern, her practiced questions about property values slipped into unrelated conversations, her gentle persistence about whether Ellie had updated her will, whether Patrick knew where all the important documents were kept. No single piece was alarming on its own. Taken together, they made a shape. Harold died that October. Sophie's Saturdays continued through the following year, though they changed in tone. Less homework, more time in the garden or in the study, sorting Harold's engineering manuals. She was 13 by then, and she had developed the particular steadiness of someone who has spent time near grief and learned to give it room. She never mentioned Vivian's name in those months, but she still paused near windows when unfamiliar cars slowed on the street. She still glanced toward whatever room Vivian had most recently occupied. The notebook stayed in her pocket. She was still watching. She had simply gotten quieter about it. Now she was 15, and I had seen her face at the lunch table that afternoon, the moment when Vivian finished listing my supposed failures, and the room went still. Sophie had not looked at her father. She had not looked at her plate. She had looked directly at me, with that expression I had first seen 3 years ago across a kitchen table, calm, collected, and entirely certain of what she had just heard. She was 15 now, and she still had that same quiet in her eyes, the kind of quiet that sees everything. I let out a slow breath, tightened my hand on the dial, and began to turn. The safe opened on the first try. Inside were 2 envelopes and a small folded note in Harold's handwriting tucked between them. I stood there in the closet doorway looking at what he had left, and I made a decision that surprised even me. Not yet. Whatever was in those envelopes, Harold had written it to be read when I was ready to act on it. And before I could act on anything, I needed to understand the full shape of what I was dealing with. I closed the safe, left the bedroom, and went to the writing desk in the study. It is a narrow desk, older than my marriage, bought secondhand in Louisville when I was young, and thought I had a book in me somewhere. The novel never came, but the desk stayed, and it had become, over the decades, the place where I did the kind of thinking that required paper and a fixed point of focus. I switched on the lamp, took a fresh legal pad from the bottom drawer, and uncapped a ballpoint pen. I wrote the date at the top. Then I began. I have always believed that fear left unexamined grows in the dark the way certain things do quietly, without announcement, until it has taken up more space than you intended to give it. The remedy, in my experience, is specificity. Name the thing. Give it edges. Put it on paper where you can look directly at it. Harold worked the same way, and I had learned it from watching him across 30-some years of marriage, though he never called it anything but thinking. I started with the most recent and worked backward. Harold's diary. For as long as I could remember, the narrow hall table near the front door had held 3 things: a ceramic dish for keys, a small framed photograph of the 2 of us taken at Cumberland Falls the summer Patrick turned 10, and Harold's old brown leather diary. He had kept it there in the last years of his life, not as an active journal, but as a kind of anchor, something familiar in a familiar place. After he died, I kept it there because it made the house feel less empty. It had been on that table yesterday morning when I left for early mass. It was gone by the time I came upstairs tonight. I wrote, Harold's diary, hall table, missing, present yesterday morning. The reading glasses. 3 weeks ago I found them sitting on the shelf above the recycling bins in the garage. I assumed at the time that I must have set them there without thinking the kind of small lapse that happens when you are moving between tasks and not paying attention. I am 79 years old, and I do not catastrophize misplaced glasses. But I wear my reading glasses at the desk, at the kitchen table, and occasionally in the garden. I have no reason to go to that particular shelf in the garage. I have not gone to that shelf in months. I wrote, reading glasses, found in garage, shelf above recycling bins, no memory of going there, 3 weeks ago. The doctor's appointment. This was the one that sat most uncomfortably, because it was the piece Vivian had used at the lunch table stated clearly, in front of Patrick and her parents, as evidence of a pattern. She had said I missed an appointment with my physician in September. I had not missed it. I had rescheduled it on a Thursday morning, in person, at the front desk, with the receptionist who has worked that office for over a decade. I have the confirmation card in the center drawer of this desk. I have the original appointment written in my calendar in blue ink, with a line through it and the rescheduled date written below in red. What troubled me was not that Vivian had it wrong. It was that she had it almost right. She knew the doctor's name. She knew the month. She had enough detail to sound credible to someone who had no reason to verify it. That level of accuracy does not come from casual conversation. I wrote, September appointment rescheduled, not missed. Confirmation card on file. How did Vivian know the name and month? The car. 5 weeks ago, on a Wednesday afternoon, my neighbor to the left, a retired school teacher I had known well enough to exchange recipes with for the better part of a decade, mentioned that she had seen an unfamiliar vehicle parked along the front of my property twice the same week. A dark sedan, she said. She had not thought much of it and brought it up the way neighbors do, as a small piece of shared observation. I had thanked her and let it pass. I did not let it pass anymore. I wrote, dark sedan, parked near front gate, twice in 1 week, 5 weeks ago. Neighbor on left observed it. No plates noted. I set the pen down and looked at the 4 items. Each one, in isolation, had an explanation. Diaries were moved, glasses were misplaced, appointments were misremembered, neighbors noticed ordinary cars on ordinary streets. That was the design of it, each piece constructed to look like the ordinary frailty of an ordinary woman living alone in a house that had grown too large for her. The kind of evidence that, assembled carefully, could be presented to a concerned son as a pattern of decline. But assembled on a legal pad at midnight, what they made was something else entirely. The only person who had been alone in my bedroom in the past several weeks was Vivian 20 minutes, 2 Sundays ago, while I was in the backyard with Sophie. The only person with a sustained interest in my medical schedule, my property, and my daily habits was Vivian. The only person at that lunch table today who had arrived with specific examples, named with the precision of someone who had been keeping records, was Vivian. I did not write a conclusion at the bottom of the page. The list had already written it. These weren't accidents. Someone had been very careful and very patient. I turned off the study lamp and walked back to the bedroom. The house was fully quiet by then, the kind of quiet that only comes after midnight, when even the street outside has settled into itself. I had been sitting at that desk long enough that my shoulders had stiffened, and I rolled them once as I crossed the hallway, an old habit from years of grading papers at kitchen tables and cramped school desks. The lamp on the nightstand was still on. The closet door was still slightly ajar, the way I had left it. I moved the winter coats aside and opened the safe. The 2 envelopes were exactly where I had seen them an hour before. I took them both, along with Harold's folded note, and carried them to the armchair by the window, the one that had been Harold's, the one I had not moved or reupholstered or replaced with something more practical, because some things deserved to stay where they were put. I sat down and held the 2 envelopes in my lap for a moment, the white one first. That was the order Harold's note specified, and I had spent enough years married to an engineer to know that when Harold specified an order, there was a reason for it. Inside the white envelope were 3 items: a folded summary of the living trust, 4 pages printed in a font size, generous enough that I did not need my reading glasses, a business card, cream-colored with navy lettering, for a James R. Caldwell of Caldwell & Associates, attorney at law, with an office address on Church Street in downtown Nashville, and a single handwritten line on a slip of paper in Harold's printing. Call him first. He knows to expect you. I read the trust summary carefully. It confirmed what Harold had told me 25 years ago at the kitchen table. The house, the savings, the investment accounts were held in an irrevocable structure that required my direct, in-person, verified consent for any transaction. No proxy, no representative, no family member acting on my behalf without my explicit written authorization, witnessed and notarized. I was the sole principal. The trust could not be dissolved, modified, or circumvented without my signature obtained under conditions that made coercion effectively impossible. Harold had thought of everything. He always did. I set the white envelope aside and picked up the blue one. Harold's handwriting was on the front, in the careful block print he used when something mattered. Open this when the time comes, you'll know. I had known for about 3 hours. The envelope was sealed with the kind of care that suggested he had pressed it closed deliberately, not hastily. I opened it along the top with my thumbnail, the way I open things I want to preserve, and took out 2 pages of his personal stationery, the cream paper with the small HW, a monogram at the top that his sister had given him years ago as a birthday gift, and that he had used for personal correspondence ever since. The handwriting was his late years print, slightly larger than his working hand, more deliberate, the letters formed with the patience of someone who knows they are writing something permanent. He began without preamble, the way Harold always began things. Ellie, if you're reading this, then something has happened that I hoped wouldn't but prepared for anyway. That's the engineering in me. I'd rather build a wall that never gets tested than need one and not have it. He wrote that he had been watching Vivian for several years before his death. Not with suspicion, he said, but with the particular attention he gave to anything that didn't quite add up. He had noticed the questions she asked at family gatherings, always pleasant, always indirect, always circling back to the same subjects: what the house might be worth in the current market, whether Harold had updated his estate documents recently, whether Ellie had her own attorney separate from their shared one. He had noticed her interest in his files on the occasions she visited the study. He had noticed the way she cataloged the house with her eyes, not with the warmth of someone who loved it, but with the assessment of someone who was pricing it. I don't say this to make you angry, he wrote. I say it so you won't be surprised, and so you won't doubt yourself when the time comes, because you will be tempted to doubt yourself. That's the part they count on. He wrote that James Caldwell had been his attorney for 14 years and was fully briefed on the trust structure and on Harold's concerns. James had instructions to take Ellie's call when it came, regardless of timing, and to act immediately on her behalf. He had been paid a retainer that renewed annually, and would continue to do so from the trust for as long as Ellie needed him. The second page was shorter. He wrote about the house, not its value, not its legal standing, but the specific afternoon in the spring of the year they bought it, when they had stood in the empty living room with paint chips spread across the floor and argued companionably about the color for the front door, and he had let her win because she was right, and the door had been that particular shade of green ever since. He wrote about the garden, and about Patrick learning to ride a bicycle in the driveway, and about the way the light came through the kitchen window on winter mornings. This house is yours, he wrote, every room of it. I need you to remember that. And then, at the bottom of the second page, in handwriting that was slightly less steady than the rest, the way a person's hand moves when they are writing the last thing, you were never the fragile one, Ellie. I just stayed close enough to make sure no one forgot it. I read that line 3 times. Then I folded the pages along their original creases, slid them back into the blue envelope, and held it against my chest with both hands. The room was very quiet. The nightstand lamp threw its amber light across the ceiling, the same as always. Outside, somewhere down Magnolia Street, a dog barked once and went silent. Harold had known. He had known years before I did, and he had spent those years quietly building every wall I would need. Tomorrow I would call James Caldwell. Tonight, I just sat in Harold's chair and held his words against my heart, and let myself feel, for a few minutes, exactly how much I had loved that man. I slept 4 hours and woke before the alarm. That is not unusual for me. I have never been a long sleeper. Harold used to say I treated rest the way I treated most things, efficiently and without excess. By 6:30 I had dressed, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table long enough to drink 2 cups and watch the light come up over the back fence. The oak tree in the corner was dropping leaves in slow, unhurried intervals, the way it did every October, indifferent to everything happening beneath it. At 5 minutes to 8, I took the cream-colored business card from the nightstand drawer where I had placed it the night before, went to the kitchen telephone, and dialed. James Caldwell answered on the second ring. His voice was measured and unhurried, the voice of a man who had been doing careful work for a long time and had learned that the tone of a conversation shapes everything that follows. I told him my name. There was a brief pause, and then he said, "Mrs. Whitmore, Harold told me you'd call someday. I'm glad you did." We spoke for 11 minutes. I gave him the outline, the missing items, the lunch table, the pattern I had assembled the night before, and he listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said he had some things to show me as well, and we agreed to meet at his Church Street office at 2 o'clock that afternoon. I thanked him and hung up. Then I put on my walking shoes and went next door. Frances Beaumont, Franny, to everyone who knew her longer than a week, had lived in the white craftsman house to my left for 20 years, which meant she had been my neighbor through Patrick's adolescence, through Harold's illness, through the 3 years since. She was 72, recently retired from 30 years of teaching high school English, and she possessed the particular combination of qualities that made her both excellent company and an exceptionally reliable witness. She was observant, she was organized, and she did not traffic in speculation. When Franny told you something, it was because she had seen it and confirmed it in her own mind before she opened her mouth. She opened the door before I had finished knocking. "I was wondering when you'd come," she said, which told me more than she may have intended. She stepped back to let me in, and I followed her through the front room overstuffed bookshelves, a reading lamp still on from the night before, a tabby cat named Senator who regarded me from the arm of the sofa with the mild contempt he reserved for everyone, and into her kitchen, where a second coffee mug was already set out on the table. I sat down, she poured. We did not waste time on small talk, because Franny and I had never needed it. "How long have you been keeping notes?" I asked. She got up without answering and went to the small secretary desk in the corner of the kitchen, the kind with the fold-down writing surface and the cubbyholes above it. She opened one of the cubbyholes and took out a folded sheaf of papers held together with a binder clip. She set it on the table between us and sat back down. "Since August," she said, 2 months and a few days." She had kept a log, 3 pages of it written in the neat, even hand of a woman who had spent 3 decades leaving margin comments on student essays. Each entry was dated, timed where possible, and written in plain declarative sentences with no editorializing. Franny had understood, instinctively or by training, that the value of a record lies in its restraint. I read it carefully. Vivian had visited the house 6 times over the 2 months, always on weekdays, always between 9 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon, the hours when Patrick was reliably at his office downtown. 3 of those visits Vivian had made alone, arriving in her own car and staying between 30 and 50 minutes. On 2 of those visits, Franny had seen her walk the perimeter of the property before entering through the side gate rather than the front door. The other 3 visits were different. On 2 occasions, Vivian had arrived accompanied by a man Franny did not recognize middle-aged, she noted, dark jacket, carrying a manila folder each time. He wore a lanyard badge around his neck, the kind issued by organizations or companies, though Franny had not been close enough to read it. They arrived in a gray sedan that Franny did not recognize as belonging to anyone on the street. They stayed longer on those visits, once for nearly an hour and a half. "I wrote down the license plate the second time," Franny said, tapping the 3rd page. "Partial. I only caught 4 of the letters before the truck blocked my view, but I wrote what I had. I looked at the entry. She had 4 characters and a note. Gray 4-door, Tennessee plates, partial." The final entry in the log was from 3 weeks ago. Franny had been deadheading her front border when she saw Vivian standing at the far end of my front walkway, near the side gate, holding her phone at arm's length in the posture of someone taking a photograph. Not a casual photograph. A deliberate one she had moved to 3 different positions before she put the phone away and left. "She didn't see me," Franny said. "I was behind the boxwood." I turned the last page over and set it down. Outside, a delivery truck moved slowly up the street. Senator had relocated himself to the windowsill and was watching it with professional interest. The coffee had gone slightly cool in my mug, and I wrapped both hands around it anyway. Franny was watching me the way she had watched her students for 30 years, waiting, patient, neither rushing the silence nor filling it unnecessarily. I didn't know if it mattered, she said finally. I looked up at her. It matters more than you know. She nodded once, the way a person nods when they are relieved that a thing they suspected was important has turned out to be important. Then she refilled my coffee without asking, and we sat together at the table while the October morning moved along outside her kitchen window, and I thought about James Caldwell's office on Church Street and what 2 o'clock might bring. I had met with James Caldwell for the first time on Monday afternoon. His office was on the 4th floor of a building on Church Street that had been a savings and loan in a previous life. High ceilings, tall windows, the kind of architecture that suggests permanence without announcing it. James himself was in his mid-60s, trim and unhurried, with the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent decades listening carefully in rooms where a great deal was at stake. He had shaken my hand, offered me water, and spent the first 10 minutes asking questions rather than answering them. I had appreciated that. We had agreed to meet again Tuesday morning, when he said he would have something concrete to show me. I arrived at 9 o'clock. The receptionist, a young woman with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, showed me to the same conference room as the day before, and James came in 2 minutes later carrying a manila folder and a legal pad of his own. He set both on the table, took the chair across from me, and opened the folder without preamble. I want to show you something, he said, and I want you to look at it carefully before I tell you what it is. He slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was a standard form, the kind with boxes and lines and small print in the margins that government and legal offices produce in quantities that suggest the world runs on paperwork, which in many respects it does. At the top, in bold type, Tennessee Evaluation of Cognitive and Legal Capacity Private Assessment Request. Below that, several lines of typed information. And at the bottom, on the signature line, designated subject, signature, and date. A signature. My signature, or something that looked very much like it. I studied it for a long moment. The name was right. The general shape was right. But there was something in the middle letters, the way the W in Whitmore resolved, that was slightly off. The way a copy of a key will turn in a lock, but with just enough resistance that you know it wasn't cut from the original. That's not mine, I said. No, James said. It is not. He explained what he had done. On Monday evening, after our first meeting, he had sent the document to a forensic document examiner he had worked with for many years, a woman who had testified as an expert witness in Tennessee state courts on numerous occasions. She had reviewed the signature against 3 authenticated samples of my signature that James had on file from documents Harold had signed with his office over the years. Her preliminary finding, delivered by email at 7:15 that morning, was unambiguous. The signature on the capacity assessment form showed inconsistencies in pen pressure, letter spacing, and the specific movement pattern of the terminal stroke that were inconsistent with my genuine signature. In her professional opinion, it was a deliberate forgery. She'll provide a written report within 48 hours, James said. It will hold up. I looked at the form again. It had been filed 6 weeks ago with a private guardianship evaluation service, a firm, James explained, that contracted with families and attorneys to conduct independent assessments of elderly individuals whose cognitive capacity was in question. The filing had been made by a representative identifying herself as a family member with the subject's knowledge and consent. She filed it as though you had agreed to be evaluated, James said. I never agreed to anything of the kind. I know. He leaned back slightly in his chair and explained what he believed had happened. The previous spring, March or April, he estimated, based on the signature's characteristics, Vivian had obtained a genuine sample of my signature. The most likely opportunity was a family gathering at which routine paperwork had been presented, an insurance renewal, a household document, something innocuous enough that I would have signed without reading every line. From that sample, she had practiced. The forgery was not rushed work. It had been done by someone who had taken time with it, who understood that a convincing forgery requires not just copying the appearance of a signature but understanding the rhythm of it, the way the hand moves, rather than simply the shape it produces. This took weeks, James said, possibly longer. I thought about the spring. I thought about the occasions in the past year when Vivian had produced paperwork in social settings, once at Patrick and Vivian's house after Easter dinner, a folder she had slid across the kitchen counter with the explanation that it was a routine update to the household insurance Patrick had asked her to handle, and could I just sign where the tabs were? I had signed where the tabs were. I had not read every page. Can she be charged? I asked. For the forgery, yes, it constitutes fraud under Tennessee law. Fraudulent execution of a legal document, potentially elder financial exploitation, depending on what she intended to do with it. James paused. But I want to advise caution on timing. If we file the complaint now, she'll know we know. And if she knows we know, she may move faster on whatever she's planning next, before we have the full picture. You think there's more? I think a person who spent months forging a signature and filing a false capacity assessment did not do it as an end in itself, he said. I think it was a step towards something larger. I'd like to know what that is before we show our hand. I sat with that for a moment. Outside the tall windows, Church Street moved through its Tuesday morning delivery trucks, office workers, the ordinary machinery of a city that had no idea what was being discussed 4 floors above it. All right, I said. We wait. James nodded and made a note on his legal pad. We agreed to speak again the following morning. I gathered my coat and my bag, thanked him, and took the elevator down to the street. The October air was cool and direct, the way Nashville air gets in the second week of the month when the humidity finally relents. I walked to my car, unlocked it, and sat inside for a moment before starting the engine. I thought about the spring. I thought about a kitchen counter and a folder, with color-coded tabs and a pen placed in my hand by someone who had been practicing my name for months. Someone had been practicing my name, and they had gotten very good at it. I had not slept well on Tuesday night. That is not a complaint. I have never expected sleep to arrive on command, particularly in the middle of a week when the ground beneath my feet had shifted considerably. I lay in bed until around 2 a.m, then got up, made chamomile tea, and sat in the kitchen reading a novel I had been meaning to finish for 3 months. I read the same page 4 times without retaining a word of it. Eventually, I gave up, set the book aside, and simply sat with the quiet until the sky outside began to lighten. The phone rang at 7:07. I answered before the second ring. James Caldwell's voice was the same measured tone I had come to recognize in 2 days of conversation. Unhurried, precise, chosen carefully, but underneath it was something I had not heard before. A contained urgency, the kind that belongs to a person delivering information they wish they did not have to deliver. I need to tell you some things, he said. Are you somewhere you can sit down and listen? I was already sitting. I told him so. He had received 2 documents late the previous evening through channels he did not elaborate on, which I understood to mean the professional network of a lawyer who had been practicing in Nashville for 30 years and knew which clerks worked late and which filing systems were accessible to those who knew how to ask. The first document was a guardianship petition filed with Davidson County Probate Court 4 days ago under Vivian's name, citing cognitive decline in Eleanor Rose Whitmore, age 79, of Magnolia Street, Nashville, Tennessee. The petition named Vivian as proposed guardian of both person and estate. It cited 3 specific incidents of alleged cognitive impairment: a missed medical appointment, a safety hazard involving a gas appliance, and an incident of disorientation reported by a family member. I recognized all 3. They were the same items Vivian had listed at Sunday lunch, delivered now as formal legal claims. There's a preliminary hearing scheduled, James said. 14 days from today. I was quiet for a moment. Through the kitchen window, the front yard was visible in the early morning light. Harold's rose beds along the front fence, the Japanese maple near the gate, that had turned completely red overnight the way it did every October, the flagstone path from the gate to the front door that Harold had laid himself one summer weekend 20 years ago, stone by stone, because he said he wanted to know exactly how level his own ground was. You said 2 documents, I said. Yes. James paused, and in that pause I understood that the second document was the one he had actually called about. The second is a preliminary sale agreement. It was drafted between a party identified as a family representative acting under anticipated guardianship authority and a development group called Pinnacle Development. The property described is the Magnolia Drive house. The listed value is $1.8 million. The kitchen was very still. Anticipated guardianship authority, I repeated. It means the agreement was drafted on the assumption that the petition would be granted, James said. Whoever drew this up was confident enough in the outcome to begin the sale process before the court had ruled. The agreement has a 30-day activation clause. It becomes binding once guardianship is established. I looked out at the rose beds again. Harold had planted the first one this spring after we moved in, a pale yellow variety he had read about in a gardening catalog and ordered by mail. He had planted every one after that over the following decade, 1 or 2 each spring, until the bed ran the full length of the front fence. He had never been a particularly sentimental man, but he had tended those roses with the same methodical care he gave to everything he decided was worth keeping. "The trust," I said. "The trust protects you," James said firmly. "The house cannot be sold without your direct, in-person, verified consent. No guardianship order overrides an irrevocable trust of this structure. I've already confirmed that with a probate specialist this morning, but," and here his voice shifted slightly, the way a careful person's voice shifts when they are arriving at the part that requires your full attention. "The protection only holds if you appear in person, at the hearing, and I file a counter motion before the hearing. Date. If you don't appear, the court may proceed on the petition's terms." "Then I'll appear," I said. "I know you will. I've already begun the counter motion." Another pause. "There's one more thing. Vivian does not know yet that we know about the petition or the sale agreement. I want to keep it that way for as long as possible. Every day she believes this is proceeding without your knowledge is a day she doesn't accelerate her timeline or remove evidence. Don't let her know we know," I said. "Exactly." We spoke for another few minutes. Logistics, documentation, what I should and should not say if Vivian contacted me before the hearing. James was thorough in the way I had come to expect from him, covering contingencies with the patience of someone who understood that in legal matters the unconsidered detail was usually the one that mattered most. When we finished, he said he would call again the following morning with an update on the counter motion. I thanked him and set the phone down on the kitchen table. Outside, a mockingbird had landed on the top rail of the front fence, directly above Harold's roses, and was cycling through its morning repertoire: 3 notes, a pause, 3 different notes, a pause. It had no awareness whatsoever of the conversation that had just taken place 4 feet away through a pane of glass. 14 days. I sat with that number for a moment, the way you sit with any number that carries real weight, not rushing past it, not letting it expand beyond its actual dimensions, just holding it steady and looking at it clearly. 14 days. I set the phone down and looked out at Harold's roses in the front yard. I had exactly 14 days to make sure they stayed mine. I had not eaten lunch. That is the kind of detail that seems irrelevant until you are standing at the kitchen counter at 2:30 in the afternoon, trying to remember whether you have done anything since the morning phone call except sit at the kitchen table and think. And you realize the answer is no. I had made a second pot of coffee. I had taken out a notepad and written down the name Pinnacle Development and the number 14, and then set the pen down without writing anything else. I had stood at the front window for a while, looking at the street without seeing it. I was back in the kitchen, finally making a proper attempt at a sandwich, when the doorbell rang at 3:15. I was not expecting anyone. Sophie was standing on the front porch with her school backpack over one shoulder, wearing her jacket unzipped despite the October chill, the way teenagers do, as though acknowledging the cold is a form of defeat. Her expression was the one I had come to know over 3 years of Saturdays, calm, deliberate, already arrived at whatever conclusion she had drawn before she knocked. "Can I come in?" she said. I opened the door wider and stepped back. She came into the kitchen the same way she always did, directly, without the tentative quality that some visitors bring into a house, as though unsure of their welcome. She set her backpack against the base of the counter, pulled out the chair at the near end of the kitchen table, and sat down. Then she took her phone from her jacket pocket and placed it on the table between us, face down. She did not say anything for a moment. I sat across from her and waited, because Sophie had always been a person who organized her thoughts before she spoke, and I had always respected that about her. 3 weeks ago, she said, Vivian came home early. I was in the living room doing homework. I was on the floor behind the armchair, the big one by the window because the light is better there in the afternoon, and I'd spread everything out on the rug. I nodded. She came in through the back. She didn't look into the living room. She went straight to the kitchen and made a phone call. Sophie paused. I heard the tone of it right away. Not what she was saying, I couldn't make out words at first, but the way she was talking. Low and flat and very fast. Like a work call, but different. Different how? Like a work call where both people already know something the rest of the world doesn't. She looked at her phone on the table. I've heard her make work calls. This wasn't that. So I picked up my phone and pressed record. She said it simply, without drama, the way she said most things. She had heard a tone she recognized as significant, and she had done the thing that preserved it. That was Sophie, not impulsive, not hesitant, just accurate. "The file is 31 minutes, she said. "I've listened to all of it." She turned the phone over, opened the voice memo application, and found the file. The timestamp at the top read 3 weeks and 2 days ago, mid-afternoon. The file length was 31 minutes and 14 seconds. She pressed play and set the phone between us on the table. Vivian's voice came through the speaker first. Indoor acoustics, slight room echo, the particular carrying quality of a voice in a kitchen. She was mid-sentence when the recording began, which meant Sophie had pressed record quickly, within the first few seconds of realizing what she was hearing. I listened. The man's voice on the other end was lower and slightly compressed the way speakerphone voices are, with a deliberate, professional cadence. He and Vivian spoke in the shorthand of people who had been having versions of this conversation for some time. She mentioned the timeline for the hearing. He confirmed the 30-day activation clause in the sale agreement. She used the phrase "the old signature already filed" in a way that indicated it was a reference both of them understood, something already accomplished and set aside. At one point, the man mentioned a logistics question about the property survey, and Vivian said they had what they needed from the exterior documentation. She had handled that herself. Toward the end of the recording, the man's voice shifted slightly, a note of impatience entering it. "What about the son?" Vivian was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. I counted. "He'll sign what I put in front of him," she said. "He always does." "And if he gets cold feet?" "Then we move forward before he has the chance," Vivian said. "We're not waiting on Patrick." The recording continued for another 4 minutes after that logistics, a reference to a follow-up call scheduled for the following week, and then the sound of the call ending and Vivian's footsteps moving out of the kitchen. 31 minutes and 14 seconds, then silence. Sophie reached over and stopped the playback. We sat without speaking for a moment. The afternoon light had shifted while we were listening, moving from the west-facing window across the kitchen floor in the particular long-angled way it does in October, when the sun has dropped lower in the sky, and the light comes in differently than it did in summer. It landed across the kitchen table between us, warm and very ordinary. I placed my hand over Sophie's. She did not pull away. She turned her hand over beneath mine and held it, the way she used to when she was younger, and had brought me something she was proud of, a drawing, a test score, a jar she had managed to open herself. The gesture was the same. Only the thing she had brought me was different. "You did exactly right," I said. She nodded once. Then she asked if she could have something to eat, because she had come straight from school and hadn't had a snack, and I realized with some private amusement that we were both of us sitting here in the middle of something considerable, and neither of us had managed to eat anything today. I got up and made 2 sandwiches. She ate hers at the kitchen table while I stood at the counter and thought about James Caldwell and 14 days and a man's voice asking about cold feet. I thought about Patrick, his name, said the way you say the name of a piece you intend to move, not a person you intend to consult. She wasn't supposed to hear it, but she did, and she came straight to me. Thursday arrived the way October mornings do in Nashville, cool and direct, with a sky so clear it looked laundered. I had slept better on Wednesday night than I had any right to expect, given the weight of what the day had held. I think that is what genuine clarity does. It settles the body even when the mind has been working hard. By 6:30, I was dressed and outside with the watering can, moving along Harold's rose beds the way I did most mornings when the weather allowed, checking the soil at the base of each plant, pulling the occasional weed, doing the small maintenance that keeps a garden from becoming something you have to fix rather than something you tend. There is a meditative quality to watering that I have always valued. It requires just enough attention to occupy the surface of the mind while the deeper levels continue their work undisturbed. I had been thinking, in that quiet subsurface way, about James Caldwell's countermotion, and about the conversation I intended to have with my son before the week was out. The phone rang at 7:43. Patrick's name was on the screen. I set the watering can down on the flagstone path, dried my hand on the side of my cardigan, and answered. "Mom." His voice had that particular quality. I recognized immediately the slightly elevated formality of a person who has rehearsed an opening. Patrick was not a natural performer. When he was 12 years old and had something difficult to say, he used to write it out on a piece of paper first and read from it, a habit his father had found endearing and I had found both endearing and instructive. He had grown out of the paper, but not out of the preparation. "Good morning, sweetheart," I said. "You're up early." "Yeah, I wanted to catch you before your day got going." A brief pause. "How are you feeling? How's the week been?" "Lovely," I said. "The roses are holding well. Another week before the first frost, I think." "Good, that's good." He was working towards something. I waited. "Mom, I wanted to talk to you about something Vivian mentioned. She ran into Dr. Reeves's office manager last week, just in passing, and apparently there was some concern flagged. About making sure you have support in place, going into winter, living alone, that kind of thing." I looked out at the yard. A pair of sparrows had landed at the bird bath near the side gate, taking turns in the shallow water with great seriousness of purpose. "What kind of support?" I asked. "Just paperwork, really. Vivian thought it might be simplest if I had a limited power of attorney. Temporary, just for practical things. So that if something came up and you needed someone to handle a document or make a call on your behalf, I could do that without it being a hole, without you having to." He stopped, started again. "It would just make things easier. For everyone." "For everyone," I repeated gently. "For you, mostly. That's what I mean." I could hear, underneath the rehearsed words, the particular frequency of a person who does not entirely believe what he is saying but has not yet found his way to the alternative. Patrick had always been a man who loved with great sincerity and analyzed with great reluctance. He preferred the world to be as it appeared. That was not a flaw, exactly. It was a vulnerability, and someone had known exactly how to use it. "Patrick," I said, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "When did you last talk to Dr. Reeves yourself? Not through Vivian directly." A brief silence. I haven't. She said she ran into the office manager and..." "That's fine," I said, keeping my voice warm. "I'm just curious. Dr. Reeves and I have a good relationship. I saw her in September and everything was straightforward. I'd hate for you to be worried based on a second-hand conversation." Another silence, slightly longer. I could feel him recalibrating, the way a compass needle swings and then settles. "So you're saying everything's fine," he said, not quite a question. "I'm saying everything is fine," I told him. "I appreciate you looking out for me. I always do. But I don't think we need to do any paperwork right now." I let that land for a moment, then added, "I would love to have lunch with you, though. Just the two of us, sometime this week. There are some things I'd like to talk to you about. Nothing urgent, just catching up properly. Would that work?" The relief in his voice when he answered was unmistakable, and it told me something important. He had not wanted to make this call. He had made it because someone had handed him the words and told him it was the right thing to do. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, that sounds really good. Friday?" "Friday is perfect," I said. "I'll find us somewhere nice." We spoke for another few minutes about ordinary things, a project he was troubleshooting at work, whether I needed anything from the grocery store, whether the Japanese maple had turned yet. I told him it had turned completely overnight, which was true, and he said he always forgot how fast that happened, which was also true. We said goodbye with the easy warmth that had been the baseline of our relationship for 52 years before the weight of this particular week had settled over it. I picked up the watering can and finished the roses. I thought about the phone call, the way you examine a piece of evidence, not with anger, because anger would have been the wrong instrument here, but with the precision the situation required. Patrick had called with a script he had not written. He had used the phrase simplest for everyone, which was not his language. It was too smooth, too designed, too useful to the person it was designed to benefit. He had cited a second-hand medical concern he had not verified and had not, until I gently pointed at it, thought to question. He was not my enemy. He was a man who loved me and had been handed a version of events that made his compliance feel like protection. My son wasn't doing this because he wanted to hurt me. He was doing it because someone had made it sound like love. That was the part I had to be careful about. I sent the text Thursday evening, after the dinner dishes were done. "Lunch tomorrow? Just us. There's something I want to show you. Short and plain, the way I write most things." Patrick replied within 4 minutes, "Of course." Named the place, which told me he had been thinking about our phone call all day and was ready for the conversation, even if he did not yet know what shape it would take. I chose Loveless Cafe on Highway 100. It is not a quiet restaurant. It is, in fact, one of the louder ones in Nashville on a Friday afternoon, full of tourists and regulars, and the particular cheerful noise of a place that has been feeding people biscuits and fried chicken for over 70 years. I chose it deliberately. A familiar place, a public place, a place where the ambient sound creates a kind of privacy, because no one can hear a word spoken below a normal conversational volume. And a place that felt, in some way, I did not want to examine too closely, like solid ground somewhere. Harold and I had eaten many times, somewhere Patrick had eaten as a boy. Somewhere the walls had absorbed enough of our ordinary life together that it felt like a reasonable location for an extraordinary conversation. I arrived 15 minutes early and took the corner booth at the back. The waitress brought coffee without my asking. I had been coming long enough that my order was known, and I sat with both hands around the mug and watched the door. I had brought a manila envelope with the documents inside, set flat on the seat beside me. My phone was in my jacket pocket. I had called James Caldwell that morning to tell him what I intended to do, and he had said, without hesitation, "Good. He needs to know." Patrick came through the door at 12:17. He looked tired in the specific way of a person who has not been sleeping well, which is different from ordinary tiredness. It sits differently in the face, around the eyes particularly, and carries with it a quality of sustained effort, as though the person has been working hard at something that should not require work. He spotted me immediately, came to the booth, and slid in across from me. He picked up the menu and then set it down again without looking at it. "I already know what I want," he said, which was Patrick's way of saying he was not here for the food. "I know what I want too," I said. The waitress came and we ordered fried chicken for him, the pimento cheese plate for me, more coffee for both. When she left, I took my phone from my jacket pocket and set it on the table between us, face up. "I need you to listen to something," I said. "All of it. It's 31 minutes. Don't say anything while it's playing, just listen." Patrick looked at the phone, then he looked at me. Something in my face must have told him that this was not a request for an opinion or an explanation. It was a request for witness. He nodded once and folded his hands on the table. I pressed play. Vivian's voice came through the speaker, mid-sentence, the way the recording began. Patrick's expression did not change. For the first minute or two, a slight tightening at the jaw, nothing more. Then Vivian said something about the timeline and he went very still. By the time the man's voice said, "What about the sun?" and Vivian answered, Patrick's hands on the table were flat and motionless, in the way hands become when the body is using all available resources for something other than movement. He did not say a word for 31 minutes. When the recording ended, I stopped the playback and set the phone aside. Our food had arrived at some point during the middle of it. The waitress had been discreet enough to set it down without interrupting, and it sat untouched between us. I reached into the manila envelope and placed 2 documents on the table beside Patrick's water glass, one at a time. First, the forensic report, 11 pages, the examiner's name and credentials at the top, her findings in the clear declarative language of expert testimony. The signature on the capacity assessment form was inconsistent with authenticated samples in 3 specific measurable ways and represented, in her professional opinion, a deliberate forgery. Second, the Pinnacle Development Preliminary Sale Agreement, the Magnolia Drive address in the property description, the $1.8 million valuation, the 30-day activation clause contingent on established guardianship. Patrick read both documents without speaking. He turned pages carefully, the way a person handles something they are not sure they want to be holding. Then I took the last item from the envelope. It was a copy of the limited power of attorney form, 3 pages, standard format, the kind that could be prepared quickly and presented as routine. I had asked James to pull it from the records Vivian had filed in anticipation. I set it on top of the other documents and turned it so it faced Patrick, and I said nothing. He looked at the signature on page 3 for a long time, his own name, in his own handwriting, on a document authorizing a representative to act on behalf of Eleanor Rose Whitmore in all financial and legal matters. "She told me it was the insurance renewal," he said. His voice was very quiet, the one we do every year. "She put it on the counter, and I signed where the tabs were." "I know," I said. He looked up at me. The tiredness in his face had not gone. If anything, it had deepened, but beneath it, something else had appeared. Not anger, not yet. Something more fundamental than anger. The expression of a person who has just understood the difference between the story they were living and the story that was actually true. He picked up his coffee cup, set it down again without drinking, looked at the documents on the table between us, looked at me. My son set down his fork. He didn't say he was sorry yet, but the way he looked at me, I could see he was finally asking the right questions. I spent Saturday morning in the garden. Not because there was urgent work to be done. The roses had been watered, the beds were tidy, the last of the summer annuals had already been cut back. I went outside because the house felt like a held breath, and I needed somewhere to put my hands while I waited for whatever came next. I deadheaded the remaining mums along the back fence, swept the porch, refilled the bird bath. Small acts. The kind that do not require thought but leave the mind free to move at its own pace. James had called at 9 to say the counter motion was complete and filed. The hearing was in 11 days. Everything that could be done from his end had been done. Now we waited. I did not know, that Saturday morning, what Patrick was doing. I learned later, in pieces. The way you learn most things that happen in rooms you were not in from the person who was there, over the course of a longer conversation than either of you expected. Patrick had driven home from our lunch the day before and said very little to Vivian that evening. He was not, by nature, a confrontational man. He processed things internally, in the same slow and thorough way his father had, and the difference between Harold and Patrick was that Harold always arrived eventually at a clear position, while Patrick had spent the better part of his adult life finding reasons to delay that arrival. That Friday evening, he told me later, he had sat in the living room watching a baseball game he did not follow and thinking about the documents I had placed on the table at lunch. Saturday morning, Vivian left at 9:15 for a client showing on the west side of the city. She would be gone, she said, until early afternoon. Patrick sat at her desk. He was not, he told me, sure what he was looking for. He knew only that he was looking, that something in him had crossed a threshold the day before and could not cross back, and that the right response to that feeling was the same response his father would have given it. Find the specific thing, name it, look directly at it. Vivian's laptop was open on the desk. It was not password protected. Patrick said afterward that this detail had stayed with him, the absence of a password on a computer belonging to someone conducting 8 months of deliberate fraud. He thought about it and decided it was a particular kind of arrogance, the assumption that no one in the house would look because no one in the house had ever looked before. He opened her email. The folder was labeled with a project code, a string of letters and numbers that meant nothing on its own, the kind of label designed to be invisible to casual eyes. He clicked it and found 341 emails arranged by date, the oldest going back 8 months, the most recent sent 4 days ago. He read for 2 hours. The correspondence was between Vivian and a man named Dwight Sears, whose email signature identified him as an attorney specializing in guardianship and elder estate law. The emails were businesslike and specific timeline coordination, documentation requirements, the mechanics of the guardianship petition, the structure of the Pinnacle Development Agreement, and the particular sequence of steps required to move from a successful petition to an executed sale within the shortest possible time frame. There were references to the capacity assessment, to the letter of authorization, to various filings Patrick did not immediately recognize. There was a thread, spanning 3 weeks, devoted entirely to the question of how to handle Ellie's irrevocable trust and Sears's conclusion, delivered in a single flat sentence, that a successful guardianship petition would not override the trust structure and that a different approach would be required. Vivian's response had been 2 words: keep going. Midway through the folder, Patrick found a payment record, a wire confirmation from a subsidiary of Pinnacle Development Group to a private account, $38,000, transferred 6 weeks ago, labeled in the memo line as a consultation retainer. The receiving account was not a business account. It was personal. He found the photographs after that, a separate folder within the project folder, dated across 4 months. Interior shots of the Magnolia Drive house, the living room, the study, the kitchen, the bedroom. Room dimensions noted in a separate document. The photographs were taken from inside the house, on days Patrick had not been present, through a lens that suggested a phone camera held at careful angles. In several of them, the edge of a familiar cream-colored cardigan was visible at the frame's periphery. Vivian had been in that house, in those rooms, photographing them without Ellie's knowledge. The last thing Patrick found was a subfolder he almost missed, nested 2 levels down, labeled with a date rather than a code. Inside were 4 documents. Each one was a page from a larger form, isolated and saved separately. Each one bore his signature. He recognized the signatures. He did not recognize the documents. He sat at the desk for a long time after that, long enough for the light in the room to shift from morning to early afternoon, long enough for Vivian to come home, say something about the client showing, ask if he wanted lunch, and accept his single-word answer without appearing to find it unusual, long enough to understand that the woman moving through the kitchen 20 feet away had spent 8 months building a structure designed to take his mother's home, his mother's autonomy, and whatever was left of the life Harold Whitmore had spent 40 years protecting. He waited until Vivian was in the shower. Then he got in his car and drove to Magnolia Street. I was in the kitchen when I heard the knock at the back door, 3 quiet taps, the pattern Patrick had used since he was a teenager coming home after curfew. I opened the door and looked at my son. He was still wearing the clothes he had put on that morning, jacket slightly wrinkled, the specific hollowness around his eyes of someone who had been reading things they could not unread. He did not come inside immediately. He stood on the back step and looked at me for a moment, in the way people look at someone they have not seen clearly in a long time. "Mom," he said, and his voice broke on the word in a way I hadn't heard since he was a boy. "Tell me everything, from the beginning." I woke at 5:30 without an alarm. Patrick had spent the weekend at the house. He had slept in his old room at the end of the hall, the one with the pine bookshelf he built in high school, the finish worn smooth at the corners from decades of use. We had not talked extensively. Saturday night there had been a long conversation in which I told him everything, and James Caldwell's name came up for the first time. After that, we had moved into a different kind of quiet, the quiet of 2 people who understand the same thing and are separately deciding what it means. Sunday had been gentle. Eggs in the morning, a walk in the afternoon, an early night. By 6 o'clock Monday, the coffee was made and the kitchen table was cleared. James Caldwell knocked at 7 on the minute. He set his briefcase beside the nearest chair, accepted coffee, and laid out the evidence packet without preamble in the order it would need to be presented. The forensic report, 11 pages. The countermotion, filed Friday and acknowledged by the court clerk. The Pinnacle Development Sale Agreement. The wire transfer receipt. Patrick's 4 documents, each separated by a paperclip, each with a typed annotation identifying the context in which he had signed. "The packet is complete," James said. "Everything we need is here." Franny arrived at 7:20 in her good coat, carrying her 3-page log in a clear plastic sleeve. She sat beside Patrick, accepted coffee, and said very little, her way of indicating she understood exactly what this morning required of her. Sophie came at 8 through the back door, the one that had been unlocked for her since she was 12. She sat at her corner of the table, opened her voice memo application without being asked, and told me she had listened to the recording again over the weekend to identify which sections had the clearest audio. She had made notes. The 5 of us worked through the morning systematically. James walked the legal timeline, the hearing date 4 days out, the counter-motion procedure, what each person present would need to provide. Franny confirmed her log dates matched James's timeline exactly. Patrick signed a sworn statement James had prepared, attesting that he had not knowingly authorized the 4 documents bearing his signature. Sophie demonstrated the recording's audio quality at normal speaker volume. James confirmed it was sufficient for the record. When the practical work was done, I made one phone call. I had spent several days obtaining the number through a process I will not detail here, except to say it required patience and the help of a legal researcher James recommended. Harold had always believed you should know your full inventory before entering any negotiation. I had applied that principle carefully. The phone rang 4 times. A young man answered, guarded, the way people are with unfamiliar numbers. I told him my name. I told him I was Patrick Whitmore's mother and that I was calling about his. I told him I had been managing a situation in Nashville for 2 weeks and that I believed he had direct experience with the same person. I told him that if he came to Nashville by Monday evening, he would have the opportunity to place what he knew on record in a setting that would use it. A long silence. Then Marcus Webb, calling from Louisville, said, "What time do you need me there?" 7 o'clock, I told him. He said he would drive up after work. I was writing down the confirmation when Vivian called. Her name appeared on my screen at 9:47. The kitchen went quiet the way it does when 5 people arrive at the same understanding simultaneously. I let it ring once, then I answered. Her voice was warm and smooth, the register she used when she considered a call social. She asked how I was feeling, whether the week was off to a good start. I told her the week was fine and I was well. She mentioned, with practiced lightness, that she hoped the coming days were not too stressful. Actually, I said, I'm having a small gathering this evening. Nothing formal, just family. Why don't you come by around 7? I'd love to see you. A half-second pause, brief enough to be deniable. Of course, she said. 7 o'clock. I set the phone down. Sophie was watching me from across the table with the same expression she had worn 3 years ago behind an armchair with a phone in her hand, calm, collected, already arrived at her conclusion. She waited until the kitchen had resettled. Are you nervous, Grandma? I considered the question honestly. What I felt was not nervousness. It was the specific steadiness that comes when every preparation available to you has been made, and the only remaining variable is time. No, sweetheart, I said. I've been ready for this for a long time. James picked up his pen. Franny straightened her plastic sleeve. Patrick refilled his coffee. Sophie put her phone in her jacket pocket. By the time evening came, every person who needed to be in that room would be there. Every piece of paper was in order. The only thing left was to let the truth do what it was always going to do. By 6:45, the living room was ready. Patrick had moved the furniture that afternoon, sofa shifted back, chairs arranged in a loose circle that was neither a courtroom nor a parlor but something in between. Franny had arrived at 6:30 and taken the chair near the window without being directed, the way a person occupies a position they have already decided on. Sophie sat on the small bench near the hallway, close enough to be present, outside enough to be apart from the center. James stood near the fireplace with his briefcase open on the side table. Patrick stood by Harold's bookcase, arms at his sides. I sat in Harold's armchair. I had not planned that consciously, but when I came into the room at 6:55 and looked at where everyone had settled, that chair was the one that made sense. Harold had sat in it for 30 years. It faced the door. It was in the plainest terms the correct chair for the person who owned the room. The doorbell rang at exactly 7 o'clock. Vivian came in wearing a cream silk blouse and the composed expression of a woman who has decided in advance how a conversation will go. She looked around the room and registered the arrangement, the circle of chairs, the faces she had not expected in a single controlled sweep. Nothing in her expression broke. She was, I had always known, very good at not breaking. Eleanor, she said, this is quite a gathering. Sit down, Vivian, I said. She sat in the one open chair, the one James had placed facing the center of the room. She crossed her ankles, set her bag on the floor beside her, and folded her hands in her lap. The picture of composure. James began. He was measured and unhurried, the way he was in all things, and he presented the evidence in the same order it had been assembled, not dramatically, not with accusation in his voice, but with the flat precision of someone laying out a structure and letting the structure speak for itself. The forensic report, the capacity assessment form bore a forged signature, confirmed by expert analysis. The Pinnacle Development Preliminary Agreement, drafted under anticipated guardianship authority, contingent on a petition that had been filed without Ellie's knowledge or consent. The wire transfer, $38,000 from a Pinnacle subsidiary to a personal account 6 weeks prior. The recording, 31 minutes of Vivian's own voice discussing timelines, contracts, and contingencies with a man Patrick had since identified as Dwight Sears. Vivian listened to all of it without moving. When James finished, she uncrossed her ankles and leaned forward slightly in the way of a person preparing to reframe. I think there's been a significant misunderstanding about the nature of... The front door opened. She stopped. A young man stepped into the hallway, late 20s, dark jacket, a manila envelope held flat against his side. He came into the living room and looked at Vivian with the particular expression of someone who has been deciding for a long time whether to be in this room and has finally decided yes. Marcus Webb set the envelope on the coffee table without speaking. He opened it and placed a sheaf of documents beside the wire transfer receipt James had laid out earlier. Court records from Louisville, Kentucky, 10 years old. The case summary on the first page was brief and factual. A guardianship petition filed against an elderly woman by a family representative, an estate liquidated, a property sold to a development company within 90 days of the petition's approval. The woman had died 8 months after the sale, in a care facility with no remaining assets. The representative named in the Louisville filing was Vivian Marsh, her maiden name, filed before her marriage to Patrick. Patrick picked up the first page. He read it standing up, beside the bookcase Harold had built, in the house where he had grown up. He read slowly. When he reached the bottom of the page, he did not turn it over. He simply held it and looked at it for a long time, in the way a person looks at something they are making themselves fully understand before they allow themselves to feel it. The room was very quiet. I waited until Patrick set the page down. Then I looked at Vivian. "I've known for 3 months," I said. "Every step you took, I saw it. I waited because I wanted every piece to be in place before I said a word." Vivian looked at me. For the first time since she had walked through my door 12 years ago, she had nothing prepared. No reframe, no redirect, no carefully chosen register. Just a woman in a silk blouse, sitting in a chair that was not hers, in a room that had never belonged to her, looking at the distance between what she had planned and what had actually happened. James stepped forward and placed 2 envelopes on the coffee table beside Marcus's documents. He identified them without elaborating. One from his office, formal notice of legal action. One from the Nashville Metro Police Department's non-emergency correspondence line, acknowledging receipt of a criminal complaint. Vivian did not reach for either envelope. She did not say it was a misunderstanding. She did not say anything at all. I looked at her for a moment longer, and then I looked away at the window, at the October dark outside, at the reflection of the room in the glass, Harold's armchair, the bookcase, the people who had come here because the truth required witnesses. She had walked in expecting to find an old woman who didn't understand what was happening. She found something else entirely. The hearing had been scheduled for a Thursday. I did not attend. James had advised against it not because my presence would have been unwelcome, but because the counter-motion was sufficiently documented that the court did not require me to appear in person, and because there are moments in a legal proceeding where the most strategic thing a person can do is let the paperwork speak without adding a body to the room that might invite questions. Harold had understood this instinctively. I had learned it from watching him manage negotiations over 40 years of marriage. Sometimes the most powerful position is the one held quietly, at a distance, until the moment arrives that requires you to be seen. James called me at 11:43 on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after the Monday evening meeting at Magnolia Street. I was in the garden when the phone rang. The roses had gone past their last bloom of the season, and I had been deadheading the canes, a task that requires attention and rewards patience. I pulled off my gloves, sat down on the low stone bench Harold had placed beside the garden gate 30 years ago, and answered. "It's done," James said. Davidson County Probate Court had dismissed the guardianship petition in full. The presiding judge had noted in her written ruling that the petition lacked credible evidentiary support, that the signature on the capacity assessment form had been determined by forensic analysis to be a forgery, and that the petitioner had demonstrated a pattern of conduct inconsistent with good faith concern for the subject's welfare. The Pinnacle Development Preliminary Sale Agreement, contingent on a guardianship order that would now never be issued, was automatically void. The irrevocable trust held, exactly as Harold had designed it to hold, 25 years ago at a kitchen table with a folder of documents and a plain statement of intent. The Tennessee Attorney General's office had accepted the criminal referral 3 days prior. Charges of fraudulent execution of a legal document and elder financial exploitation were under active review. James was careful to note, as he always was, that charges accepted for review were not yet charges filed, but the referral had been accepted, and the investigation was proceeding. Dwight Sears, the guardianship attorney who had coordinated with Vivian over 8 months of correspondence, was facing a formal bar complaint. The complaint cited a financial relationship between Sears and the care facility where Ellie had been slated for placement, a conflict of interest that, if substantiated, would constitute a serious violation of professional conduct rules. The Tennessee Board of Professional Responsibility had acknowledged receipt. The trust Harold built, James said, was the wall she never found a door in. I sat on the stone bench for a moment after he said that and looked at the rose canes in front of me, stripped back now, ready for winter, the structure of the plant visible, in a way it wasn't when the blooms were full. Harold had planted the first one, the spring after we moved in, and tended each one after that with the same unhurried care. He had never once described them as a legacy. He would have found the word excessive, but that was what they were in the end. Things built with patience, designed to outlast the season. I thanked James and told him I would come to the office that afternoon to review the formal documentation. He drove to Church Street 2 hours later. The building on a Tuesday afternoon was quieter than it had been on my previous visits. Fewer people in the lobby, the elevator unhurried, the conference room waiting with the familiar high windows, and the particular quality of light that came through them in late October, lower and more golden than it had been in September. James had the documents laid out in a neat stack. I read each one carefully, as I read all documents, and signed where my signature was required. When we had finished, James's assistant knocked and brought in a message that had come in that morning from a law firm in Savannah, Georgia. They had heard through the professional channels that legal communities use to share information about significant cases about the outcome of the Whitmore matter. They had a client in a comparable situation and wanted to discuss whether James might be available for consultation. James looked at the message and then at me. "Word travels," he said. "Harold always said a good wall doesn't need advertising," I told him. "People notice when something holds." I drove home on Church Street the same way I had driven in past the same intersections, the same storefronts, the same stretch of Nashville that had gone about its business for 2 weeks while a legal proceeding quietly resolved itself in a downtown courtroom. The October light was the particular clear gold of late afternoon at this latitude, the kind that makes even ordinary streets look considered. At the corner of Magnolia, I pulled over for a moment and sat with the engine idling. 2 weeks ago, a woman had sat in my living room and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. She had filed documents, paid money, practiced signatures, coordinated attorneys, photographed rooms, and constructed over 8 months a plan designed to remove me from the house I had lived in for 32 years and the life Harold and I had built inside it. She had relied on the assumption that I was what I appeared to be, an elderly woman living alone, manageable, unlikely to look carefully at what was being arranged around her. She had spent months trying to prove I wasn't capable. In the end, every document she filed only proved that I was. November had come in quietly, the way it does in Nashville after a hard October. The mornings were colder now, the light arriving later and leaving earlier. The garden shifted into its winter configuration beds mulched, the last of the annuals cleared away, the perennials cut back to their crowns. There was still work to be done out there, the slow maintenance of a garden preparing for dormancy, and I had taken to spending an hour outside most mornings before the day made other demands. I was in the back beds on a Saturday morning, working along the far edge of the property where Harold had planted a row of shrub roses in the early years older varieties, tough and unfussy, the kind that do not require constant attention but reward the attention they receive. I was checking the mulch depth at the base of each plant when I heard the knock at the back door. 3 taps, quiet and evenly spaced. I knew that knock. I had known it since Patrick was 17 years old and coming home past the hour he was supposed to, using the back door because it was closer to the stairs and because he had always believed, incorrectly, that I slept more soundly than I did. I set down my trowel and went inside. He was standing on the back step in a jacket that was not quite warm enough for the morning, his hands in his pockets, his hair slightly disheveled in the way of a person who had not been sleeping regular hours. He looked better than he had at Loveless Cafe 3 weeks before the specific hollowness around his eyes had eased, but he also looked like a man in the middle of something difficult, which he was. "I should have called," he said. "No," I said. "Come in." I put the kettle on while he sat down at the kitchen table, the same chair he had occupied since childhood, the one closest to the window, the one with the view of the backyard. I had always found it telling that Patrick, even as an adult, gravitated toward the seat that faced outside rather than the one that faced the room. Harold had been the same way. Men who think best when they have something to look at that isn't the problem directly in front of them. The coffee was fresh. I poured 2 mugs and set one in front of him before I sat down across the table. He wrapped both hands around the mug the way people do when they need something warm to hold. He looked at the table for a moment, then he looked up. "I filed the divorce papers last Thursday," he said. I nodded, and I started seeing someone, a therapist, Wednesday afternoons. He said it plainly, without apology or qualification, which told me he had already done the work of deciding it was the right thing and was not looking for my opinion on whether it was. I respected that. "I'm glad," I said, and I was. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a cardinal landed briefly on the fence post, near the gate, a flash of red against the gray November morning, and then lifted off again. Patrick watched it go. "I knew something was wrong," he said. "Not the specifics, not what she was actually doing. But I knew for more than a year, probably longer, that something in the house wasn't right. The way she talked about you, the way she handled certain things, the way she'd come home sometimes and be in a particular mood that I'd learned not to ask about." He paused. I didn't look because looking felt like it would cost me something I wasn't ready to lose. He set the mug down and looked at his hands. "I let her tell me what you needed," he said. "I let her tell me you were struggling, that you needed help, that it would be better for everyone if I let someone else be the authority on my own mother. And I knew, somewhere, that it wasn't right. I just chose not to know it all the way." The kitchen was very quiet. Through the window, the back garden sat in its November stillness. Mulched beds, bare branches, the patient architecture of things that have gone dormant but are not gone. I thought about what to say and what not to say. There are moments in a long relationship when the wrong words, even well-intentioned ones, can close a door that has just been opened with considerable effort. Patrick had not come here for absolution. He had come because he needed to say these things out loud to the person they concerned, and because he was, underneath everything, a man who believed that the truth owed a debt to the people it had cost. I poured a second cup for him, though his first was not yet finished. Then I set it in front of him and said, "Rebuilding takes longer than breaking, but it's the only thing worth doing." I looked at him directly. "Are you ready for that?" He did not hesitate. "Yes," he said. I pushed the second cup closer to him. He picked it up. We sat together at the kitchen table in the November morning, and for a while neither of us said anything, and the silence between us was the comfortable kind, the kind that does not need to be filled because it is not empty. Before he left, he asked if he could come for dinner on Sunday. I said yes. He asked if Sophie could come too. I said of course. She was always welcome. He did not need to ask. He smiled at that, a real one, not the careful kind he had been producing for the past several weeks, and kissed me on the cheek at the back door the way he had done since he was old enough to reach it. I watched him walk to his car through the kitchen window. He held his shoulders differently than he had at the cafe. Not lighter, exactly, the weight was still there, because weight like that does not disappear in 3 weeks, but differently, like a man who had decided to carry what was his and set down what was not, and was still in the early stages of learning which was which. I didn't tell him it would be easy. I told him it would be worth it, and I meant every word. Spring came back to Magnolia Street the way it always does without asking permission. The dogwoods went first, the way they always do in Nashville, white and pale pink along the full length of the street, before anything else had decided to bloom. I noticed them on a Tuesday morning when I opened the front door to collect the mail and found the whole street changed overnight. The bare branches of the week before now heavy with blossoms, the light coming through them in that particular dappled way. That only happens for about 3 weeks each year before the leaves fill in, and the effect is gone until next April. I stood on the front porch for a longer moment than was strictly necessary and looked at it. 6 months. I went back inside, poured a second cup of coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with Harold's blue envelope in both hands. I had taken to keeping it on the windowsill above the kitchen sink, not in the safe, not in the nightstand drawer, but in the light where it could be seen. Harold had written it to be used, and it had been used, and now it lived in the place in the house where the morning sun came in first. That felt correct to me. Harold had always believed that useful things deserved to be kept somewhere accessible. The kitchen was quiet in the particular way of a house that is lived in and well. Not empty quiet, not the quiet of the first year after Harold died, which had a texture to it, a weight, but the settled quiet of a place that has found its rhythm again and is content with it. On Friday afternoons, Sophie came. She had proposed it herself. Back in January, she had heard that Ellie was planning to donate Harold's engineering papers to the Vanderbilt Library's Technical Archive, and she wanted to help sort them. I had accepted without hesitation because I recognized the offer for what it was. Not obligation, but genuine interest from a 16-year-old who had inherited, from some combination of nature and proximity, the same habit of careful attention that had made Harold's papers worth donating in the first place. We worked at the dining room table, which had become our Friday office. Sophie had developed a system papers sorted by project type first, then by date, each group paper-clipped and labeled in her neat handwriting before going into the archival boxes Vanderbilt had sent. She asked questions as she worked, real ones, about what the notations meant and why Harold had kept certain correspondence and not others. I answered what I could and marked what I couldn't with a small sticky note for the archivist. It was, I had come to think, one of the more satisfying ways I had spent a Friday afternoon in years. Patrick came for Sunday dinner most weeks now. He looked different than he had in November, not dramatically, not in any way that would be obvious to someone who hadn't known him for 52 years, but different in the way that matters. The careful quality had left his face. He laughed more easily, at smaller things, the way a person laughs when they are not monitoring themselves. He had moved into an apartment on the east side of the city in February, a place he had described to me as clean and quiet and entirely his own, which I understood to mean exactly what he said. His therapy continued. He had not spoken much about it to me directly, and I had not asked, because some work is done best without an audience. Franny joined us for dinner most Sundays. She had taken to bringing cornbread, which she made from a recipe she claimed was her grandmother's, and which I had no reason to dispute, because it was excellent cornbread. She and Patrick had developed an easy rapport, two people who had been in the same room at a significant moment and had, afterward, become something more than acquaintances because of it. There was a particular kind of friendship that formed in the wake of difficult things, and I had learned over 79 years to recognize it and not to question it. James had sent a note the previous week. A legal advocacy organization in Louisville, one that worked with elderly individuals at risk of financial exploitation, had contacted him after hearing about the outcome of the Whitmore matter through the professional network. They were developing a model trust document for distribution to families who could not afford private legal counsel, and they wanted to include a written account of the trust structure Harold had created as an example of what effective long-term planning looked like in practice. James had asked, in his careful way, whether I would be willing to contribute something. I had written back the same afternoon, yes. Harold had built that wall for me. The least I could do was describe how it was made, so that someone else might build one of their own. I turned the blue envelope over in my hands, running my thumb along the sealed edge the way I had done many times since October. I did not need to open it. I had read the 2 pages inside often enough that I could have written them from memory. And in some ways I had, in the months since the Monday evening when everything resolved itself in my own living room, I had returned to those pages often, not for instruction, but for the particular comfort of a voice I knew well saying things it had taken years for me to fully understand. I opened the envelope one more time. The 2 pages of Harold's personal stationery were slightly more worn than they had been in October, the folds softened, the corners rounded from handling. His handwriting was the same, deliberate even, the careful block print of a man who understood that the permanence of a written thing begins with the intention behind it. I read to the last paragraph. Then I read the last line again, the way I always did. You were never the fragile one, Ellie. I just stayed close enough to make sure no one forgot it. I sat with that for a moment. Then I folded the pages along their original creases, slid them back into the blue envelope, and walked to the kitchen window. The dogwoods were visible from here, the tops of them, white and unhurried, doing what they had always done in April without any assistance from anyone. I set the envelope on the windowsill where the morning light came in first, propped against the small clay pot Sophie had given me last Christmas, and stood there for a moment with both hands on the edge of the sink, looking out at the blooming street. Harold was right. He usually was. The strongest thing I ever did was simply refuse to disappear. And I am still here, every quiet, certain inch of me.